let's think about then why we would assess. And some of these will be fairly logical, I think, and some of them will perhaps be a little bit more outside of the box. But all of them apply. Now, the key point is they don't all have to apply at the same time. Okay, that's fundamental. Well, start with this. Why is it being carried out, and who is it being performed for? We'll come to the who is it being performed for stuff in the seminar, because that is really, really important and has got big legal issues with it. Because if an athlete comes to you to be tested, and they come independently, so they've paid and they're coming in, then it's pretty obvious who it's for. It's for them. What happens if an athlete comes to you, say, through, I don't know, let's put it into context. Like, let's say Active Anglia send one of their performance athletes to be tested, and you're picked to test them next year. Okay? Now the question is, who's the test for? Is the test for the athlete? Is the test for Active Anglia? Is the test for the coach? Then the question is, who owns the data? Do you own the data? Does Active Anglia? Does Martin Beaver, who heads up Active Anglia? Does the coach? Does the athlete? Then it gets even more complicated. What happens if they're under 18? Who owns it then? Child? Parent? Guardian? Coach? Physiologist? So on. Then imagine it's I'm talking really high performance, like world-class sport. So imagine you were working with somebody like a Tom Daley. So when Tom Daley was, I watched some footage before I came out, they were showing child prodigies, and they were showing Tom Daley at the age of 13 when he won European gold. Extraordinary. He'd have been tested. So he's 13 years old. He's in a high-performance environment, which means you've got all the issues we just talked about, plus you have a physio, a nutritionist, a strength and conditioning coach, a podiatrist, a biomechanist, a psychologist. Who gets to see the data? Okay. Don't answer it now, think about this, but of course it has the same relevance as the idea of going to see the doctor who gets to see your data. So think about why it's being carried out. Is there a sound rationale? And these are the top 7, well, the only 7, I would say, really, that count. First one is, look, in most instances, we use it to evaluate strengths and weaknesses. So we use this on an ongoing basis to check where the athlete is in relation to training, in relation to progression, in relation to performance. And so we can set a series of goals based upon the strengths and weaknesses. Let me be clear, and this is something we'll come to in a moment, do not overstep your boundary. You are not a coach in this context. In this context, you're the exercise scientist, so in no way do you prescribe training. In my young and zealous youth, I kind of overstepped that boundary. Okay? So when I first started working, many of you perhaps don't know, I've had a slightly varied career apart from being here. I've worked in the past UK Athletics. I also worked and tested Newcastle United in the era of people like, you won't remember these people, David Ginola, Ferdinand, Asprilla, and so on. So I was about your age. I was very lucky I had an internship. So we get this data, and I'm like, it's Dave Britton. So I start saying, you need to do this and this. How am I to tell David Ginola that actually you need to cut your hair and you need to... You're not the coach. You're going to step on the coach's shoes, and we have a problem. We have a problem with exercise science. It's very hard at the moment, still hard now, to get coaches to buy into the philosophy. It's getting better because you guys are graduating. We've got these young up-and-coming coaches, and we've got coaches now there's much, much more realism about the way sports science helps. But there's still a lot of coaches who are very wary of the physiologist and the sports scientist. What are you going to offer me? You're telling me that I'm training my athlete incorrectly. So be very careful about the boundaries. You can repeat point 1, the strengths and weaknesses, in relation to something like rehab. So an athlete can go through a process of rehabilitation. We're now going to look at how they're coping with that, getting them back to performance. And that's classic thing in many of the areas, for example, strength and strength conditioning. So when we look at isokinetic dynamometry next semester, the articulated dynamometer is used a lot now in terms of rehabilitation. It allows us to compare the damaged limb to the contraindicated limb to the non-damaged limb. You use the non-damaged limb as the gold standard, and you compare against that all the time. Has anybody torn their ACL in this group? Oh, no ACL tears. Wow. PCL? No, okay. Last year we had about 3 torn ACL. Because the thing that's quite gruesome is when you tear the ACL, before they do surgery, they look to see how far the knee will move. Okay? They want to see what the range of motion is. At that point, by the way, it doesn't really hurt because you're pretty doped up on morphine or whatever. But they move it. In other words, what's the maximum range of motion? And then they compare that to the maximum range of motion to the non-damaged limb. And then through rehabilitation, of course, what should happen is you should start to get alignment in terms of the range of motion of the two joints. These are very much, that is points 1 and 2, are very much what I would call performance orientated. And many of you may not be performance orientated or even performance interested. Points 3 and 4, which is health-related assessments and monitoring of physical fitness, are very much about exercise, health and well-being. And this again is becoming a really big area. Many of you, I suppose, go to gyms and you go to fitness clubs and you go and get tested, you go and get assessed, and they kind of make a report on your physical fitness and your well-being and so on. Well, in essence, one of the things I would do is always ask, what the hell are you testing me for? Okay, and the key with this is now there are the 2 levels. There's kind of the physical fitness level, but there is also now this clinical level. A number of years ago, about 2 years ago, I had a med student who came and did a research project with me, and we did a study where we exsanguinated people. In other words, we took half a litre of blood out of them. And we got them to do VO2 max tests with half a litre of blood missing. And she came and she did it, and it was fantastic. She really enjoyed it and thought it was really good. But I remember saying to me, I've really enjoyed the idea of doing research, but I'm not sure I'm ever going to use this. But I've learned. I got an email off her last week saying, I can't believe it. I'm now working I'm actually in the clinic. I'm working down at Bart's. Sorry, not Bart's, St. George's. And we're doing VO2 max testing on patients prior to surgery. And one of the things we're looking at is hemoglobin levels. And we're using the criteria, do they produce a satisfactory VO2 response? Not what the max is, but the VO2 response, the kinetic response that we're going to look at. If they don't, they are not put forward for surgery because they are more than likely going to die under anaesthetic. People then try to get them fit enough to have the surgery. So there are all sorts of levels. We can now also use the techniques we're going to look at to identify pathologies. So don't just think about what we're doing over this year as being performance-based. All of these, that's points 1 to 4, are then related to the idea of setting short-term goals. I mean, you could use them for long-term goals, but long-term goals tend to be, particularly with performance, 1 to 4 years, quite long. These tend to be the idea of short-term goals, maybe 2 cycles within a training plan, that's 8 weeks, and then monitor again. So you kind of say, right, how do we get on in relation to these components? What are the strengths and weaknesses? If there was a weakness, what are we going to do about it? Make the evaluation and retest. So you're continually monitoring an athlete or an individual. Point 6, it is an educational tool. It's educational in the sense of the data that is collected is what provides the resources in terms of the textbooks. It provides resources in terms of some of the images that you see on places like YouTube and so on. But more importantly, it provides an education in terms of the understanding of human physiology. You are in such a fortunate position. I'm sure you've got friends that are doing things like biomedical science and so on, who this year are doing anatomy and physiology. Brilliant. Well, unless I'm mistaken, anatomy and physiology is the same whether you're an athlete or a member of the general public. It's identical. Just happens to be that you get to experience it and get to see it in action. They never get it. They don't see it. It provides you with a brilliant way of understanding and learning the way in which the body functions. So it's a really, really cool tool. And then the final thing is research purposes. And research underpins everything that we do. Without research, we wouldn't be able to do points 1 to 6. Because we wouldn't know what was the most appropriate routine, we wouldn't know what's the most appropriate way. But we then carry on doing research in order to improve performance or in order to improve health and well-being of the individual. So, if when you are going to assess an athlete, you cannot pinpoint at least one of these, do not test. It's pointless. You're wasting your time, you're wasting the individual's time. You're getting nothing meaningful out of that data set. Okay.